Hi, indie developers and people who aren't indie developers but just enjoy watching game development content. I did a video recently on my channel about how I would personally approach making a game design document. That's the document that helps you plan out your game before you start making it or as you're making it. And that was based on my experience with teaching game design students, and it was also based on my experience of working in industry. Documentation generally is a bit of a contentious subject. There's not really a single one way to do it, and some people don't believe in doing documents at all. Today I wanted to try something slightly different and just to take you through a couple of the game design documents from some classic games. As a game design enthusiast and a teacher, I've built up a collection of these over the years, so I'm going to put a link in the description so you can get hold of these and some more to take a look through. Okay. Diablo. Everyone knows Diablo. If you didn't play the first Diablo, you've probably played a more recent one. It's actually described here as a pitch rather than a game design document, but I think this is filled out enough for it to be considered a game design document. I think one of the things that's really striking about this is that the game idea it describes still matches up with what we've got 20 years down the line. Is it 20 years? 30 years down the line with Diablo 4. The only thing that's any different here is that the original game was meant to be turn-based. So you've got here in this original pitch, the entire game operates on a turn-based system, and we know that Diablo is not a turn-based game, but there's so much else here that is still just very much similar to what we've got in Diablo today. Some things that really stand out for me here is a multimedia document. It has these little illustrations in. They are just bits of royalty-free art from like old medieval paintings, but they help set the tone for the game. I'm not going to read through every little bit, but pick out some key elements. Diablo is a role-playing game wherein a player creates a single character and guides him through a dungeon in an attempt to find and destroy Diablo, the devil himself. Nowadays, most places would tell you not to use a male pronoun for your player. You should call your player them, because you shouldn't assume that the player of your game is male. All the action takes place in an isometric 3/4 perspective with diamond-shaped square floor spaces. See the diagram. The entire game operates on a turn-based system. Using a mouse, the player moves their character from space to space, exploring corridors and rooms and engaging in combat. The character faces challenges in the form of hostile monsters and traps in their quest to descend deeper into the dungeon. Many beneficial weapons and magical items can be acquired and used to help on the quest. And I think I talked about this in my previous video, but they're sort of painting in broad strokes here. They're saying there will be a bunch of weapons and items, but they don't go into detail here because it's an overview, right? And one of the principles I tried to teach before about documentation is to always start with the broad and general and then get more specific as you go down, right? You don't need the specific stuff up front. The heart of Diablo is the randomly created dungeon. A new dungeon level is generated each time a level is entered using our dynamic random level generation system. Yeah, so rogue goes back to the 80s, but when Diablo came out, roguelike wasn't a genre, so it wasn't like, oh, there's this cool new roguelike. It was just the only game I'd seen as a kid in the 90s to have this procedural generation. Now it's such a normal thing. This system facilitates the inclusion of puzzles and traps and helps the addition of thematic elements. Deeper levels will contain progressively more difficult creatures and hazards. A character's quest ends with the defeat of Diablo located deep in the dungeon. Some of this might seem obvious to you, like deeper levels will contain progressively more difficult creatures and hazards. That's just what games do, right? But having it up the top here is really helpful because, again, it's telling you what the broad approach of the design is. We've got a plot and setting section. There's also certain choices about the typography that kind of put you in mind of, like, this kind of looks like a gravestone font. It's quite easy to read. It's not an overly decorative font, but they've started to include some of the graphic design ideas that the game should incorporate in this presentation, in this pitch document, which I think is interesting. And I think when you're in the early stages of making your games, whether you're making a GDD or like a pitch presentation, thinking about the presentation of your game and incorporating that into the graphic design of these documents can be quite a helpful thing to do at the start. Here's a thing that didn't make it into the final. A player generating a new character is first presented with a choice of race. We plan to offer 5 or 6 human races, hill people, forest people, etc., each with advantages and disadvantages. After race, the player will select their desired class, choosing a fighter, thief or magician, or possibly subclasses of these. Although all characters will be able to use most weapons and cast some spells, different classes will provide special advantages. So you can see that the original idea was a lot closer to a classic Dungeons and Dragons thing where your character has both a class and a race, and in the end they ended up with these kind of archetypes of like the sorcerer, the warrior, whatever they are. One of the things that was quite strange about Diablo when it came out, especially for a Western RPG, was that it was all kind of rooted in this very kind of European Gothic Catholic tradition of there are things like goblins and stuff, but it's all kind of demonic. It's all rooted in biblical stuff, and even the names of some of the bosses like Lazarus and stuff like that, they're all things from the Bible. It's not something that takes a lot of its genealogy from like Tolkien, which is dealing more with like pagan Norse fantasy type stuff. That's where we get things like elves and gnomes from. The fantasy in Diablo is much more this angels and devils and people in the middle kind of thing. If anything, that's what makes Diablo feel quite unique. And it might not feel so unique if you're used to, say, Japanese games and anime, where there's a lot of use of European Gothic and a lot of use of like Catholic imagery that we get in a lot of anime and a lot of like JRPGs where they, team up and go and kill God. For a European or American game in the 90s, that was quite an unusual thing.
Perhaps the time has come to reveal who I am.
When you did fantasy, even if it was dark fantasy like Conan, it tended to be more rooted in this kind of Tolkien thing and not in this sort of Christian iconography thing. So I think that's an interesting part of Diablo that's been there since the beginning. If you've joined the Diablo series later on, sort of from 3 or 4, then this isn't really the format anymore, where you have, the entire game takes place in this descending dungeon and then you have the town nearby. You have a series of towns and it's not always the same. The fun really begins when the player guides his character down the road and enters the abandoned temple. At this point, the computer generates the layout of the first level. This is what like app developers or software developers would call a user story. It's like presenting us it in steps of what the player sees, what the player does at each stage. The player can see as much of the dungeon as is visible to the character, determined by lighting, line of sight, and magical factors. Areas not brightened by light sources fade into blackness. Magical darkness can block light sources. Improvision can detect heat sources within dark areas. And so on and so forth. Have a think about what some of the general principles are here. It's got like a project plan here as well. The stuff that talks about the game design sort of, again, starts with the general, starts broad, and then narrows down into specifics the further you go into the document. That's still a really good general principle to apply. The second document I want to show you is for a little old game called Grand Theft Auto. But the document isn't called Grand Theft Auto because that's not what the game was called when it first started being made. The game that was being made was called Race and Chase, which is a wonderful name. And the thing that's so strange about this particular document is, well, there's a couple of things actually. The first thing is that the initial game is not about being a criminal. Yeah, look, the player controls a police car and must stop a getaway car from escaping. Other police cars are controlled by the computer or by other network players. So it was originally kind of thought of as being this multiplayer cops and robbers game where some people would play the police and some people would play the criminals. And I think eventually this project got to the point where they thought, playing the police is not fun in this context. I want to be the person who doesn't care. I want to be the person that runs people over. I want to do all this stuff. And anyone who's played L.A. Noire, where you play a detective, but it's using I think it would have been GTA 4 engine to. It's so strange to be playing one of those games in an action game engine and to be put in the role of the person who's not supposed to crash their car or run anyone over. So it's interesting to see how this design developed from something that was a cops and robbers game where you could do both, later into a game that was just about being the criminal, because ultimately it was about where is the fun in this game, and being the police was not as fun as not being the police, so they cut it out. Really interesting bit of project detail there for you. If you're, I talk a lot on this channel about scope because it's one of the things that indie developers quite frequently have a lot of problems with. It's one of the most famous games franchises ever. It's a household name, and it's a game about being a criminal, and the original one had the option to be policing and it was cut out because it wasn't fun. It really highlights what successful game developers do when they're thinking about scope. Remember, scope isn't just about size. It's not about whether something is big or small. It's about what you're focused on. Whenever anyone mentions scope, try and think of a telescope. Literally, when you zoom in on stuff, you cut things out and you can't see them anymore. And that's the size element that people usually mean when they talk about scope. But what you're also doing is you're zooming in on one thing and you're making it more defined. It took out the element where you could be the police, and they focused the game much more on a life of crime. The second thing that is particularly weird about this document, that it's not fun for me to read through it in this video, but I'll just point it out to you and you can go and look yourself. About half of this document is technical specs. 5.8.1 car sprites. As the light source is directly overhead, rotation can be done in software. This means storing only 3 frames per car. Deltas will be drawn onto the car sprite. It's incredibly technically detailed. And this isn't what would normally be in a design document, because that kind of detail is something that the programmers, the engineers on a team might document separately, or they'll just work out as they go, because it's not really the design, it's not the player facing gameplay stuff. But so much of this document is about storage. I think a reasonable assumption to make is that's because this is a game that has emerged out of a tech demo, right? You've got this whole thing of how can we make a big city? And that might not be a big problem nowadays, but when the first GTAs were coming out, it was a big problem. Like, if I want to make a big environment, how do I save that? And how do I make it all streamable in one go? So a lot of this early prototype for this game comes out of them trying to build a big city that you can drive around. You get to the point where they've got some sort of game in there where you can drive around and chase each other and stuff. And then all of the stuff that we think of as GTA, the like flavor of the world, the way that characters speak and the things that you have to do for missions, all of that stuff comes much, much later on. And I think that's a really interesting example of how the things which are the unique selling point, the things which are the secret sauce of a game, might not be there from the beginning. They might not be there until years down the line. And I think people who watch this channel who've been working on a game for a very long period of time, hopefully you'll find that inspiring to some degree, that you could take something you've been working on for a while and put some twist on it, and take some stuff out and put a twist on it, and just end up with something that was just kind of sitting there doing nothing, no one was interested in it, to suddenly, oh wow, it's something that people really want to play. And I think there are a few interesting things you can get from looking at this document, but I think the fact that GTA was originally a cops and robbers game where you could be the police is probably the most interesting one from my perspective. But if you're a nerd for technical stuff, then have a look through that stuff on this document as well, because you might find it interesting. The third one is Sam and Max Hit the Road.
Another confused census taker? Actually, it was the commissioner with another idiotic and baffling assignment. Does it involve wanton destruction? We can only hope.
My understanding is that the person who led this project, Sam and Max, were his characters who he'd drawn for a long period of time, and at some point he was asked within LucasArts, oh, why don't we make a game with your characters? And this is the game design document for Sam and Max Hit the Road, which, if you've never played it, it's in the same vein as the early Monkey Island games, the early point and click adventure games. which we still have nowadays, and there have been more recent Sam & Max games that are made in 3D and everything, but they tend to follow the more modern design where you don't pick up an item and then have to randomly discover how to use it 3 hours later. They're a little bit more contained and streamlined, but the original ones were much more sprawling. And one of the things that's particularly amusing with this document is, well, I mean, you probably clocked it already. It says, Sam & Max Hit the Road, an adventure game based on the collected works of Drew Barrymore. And we've got, hey, where's our logo? There's not enough room in the budget for one. What's going on here? Okay, we've got a comedy game, and instead of the front page saying, Sam & Max Hit the Road, a funny comedy game, instead, it says something comedic that sets the tone of the game and tells you about the comedy of the game. And this is all the way through the document. Would I recommend you do this normally? No. Remember before I've talked about project pillars, like 3 things that are really important to the experience in your game. And they're not genre. It's not like, oh, the game is a platformer. They should be emotional pillars of what the player is getting out of this game. And in Sam & Max Hit the Road, comedy is one of those things. It's one of the forms of fun that players are supposed to get from engaging with this game. It's key to the experience. If you don't like the sense of humor, the game is not for you, right? And this is putting its design pillar of fun and humor up front, like on the front page. So although you wouldn't normally do this in a lot of places for a technical document that says here's what we're going to make, it's actually really smart here, because you just know even before you've opened it what the nature of this project is, which is going to be this kind of oddball comedy thing. And it's been 20 years since I played this game, so I don't remember how much of this matches up with the original. Bigfoots? I don't remember anything about Bigfoots. It's a premise, Sam. Run with it. This is very much the tone of the writing in Sam & Max, that they will break the fourth wall in the game and they will talk about what's happening in the story and everything. And we have them here doing that in the game design document. And I think that is a really interesting way of doing things that I think you could use even for a more serious game. If you're making a game with characters, having them pop up in your documentation and explain things in the world is a really cool method of, just like the Diablo document experimented with graphic design and presentation within the document to start giving you a flavour of how things in that game world look. In Sam & Max, we've got characters talking about the game within the document, which can be a really neat way of starting to kind of think out loud about the tone of the dialogue that we're going to get in the game. And it is a dialogue heavy game because the entire game is talking to characters and solving puzzles. Remember, nothing here is final, right? But it's a place where you can experiment with certain things. And here we've got, what have we got in terms of sections? We've got the story, people to see, and we've got a list of characters. You can imagine how a game design document for a narrative heavy game would front load this information, right? Because the characters are going to be way more important in this than they might be in a GTA. So we have that further up, closer to the top, so you get to it sooner. We have the locations, so you get to them sooner. And then I think they have puzzles a bit further down. I don't think the tone of this is how you would write a professional document in most studios. It's great because it's doing 2 things at once. It's describing the game as a game design document should do, but it's doing it in the tone of the game. If you think of who's going to be using this document, it might be programmers, artists on the team. It might be someone higher up in the company, like someone in production, or someone at the publisher who wants to fully understand what you're making. All of this stuff where they're kind of introducing the comedic voice of the game into the document is like helping get you on board so that the game is going to be less surprising to you later on and you already know what to expect. I think now is a nice time to tell you about my merchandise that you can get now. If you really want to support this channel and you don't want to commit to something like a Patreon subscription or a YouTube membership, then you can buy one of my delicious Playtester Tears mugs, and then when you've had lots of playtesters cry over how difficult or terrible your game is, then you can rehydrate yourself with their salty tears.
Floor shows.
I remember my childhood in Brighton.
Other interfaces will show up from time to time in Sam & Max Hit the Road, like say when playing with the Whack-A-Rat game, but these interfaces will tend to be of the simple point and click variety. No combat, no HAL crash, and no Verschlagene submarines. I don't know what any of that means. When they have stuff like these mini games like Whack-A-Rat and stuff like that, they are using language which indicates that this is not a central part of the game. It is an additional thing. Don't hold me to this kind of thing. And when you're writing documentation and plans, it's really important to be aware of how certain your language is. You know, will, should, could, right? Or would, should, could. There's like a hierarchy of how definite that language is. And whenever you're writing a document, even a very silly one like this, it's important to sort of be clear about what is central to the experience, what you are actually definitely going to include, and what things like these mini games are like, yeah, maybe stretch goal type stuff. Because if you don't do that, someone is going to get upset along the line that they think you promised something and you didn't do it. Now, number 4 on my list is all in Japanese, and I can't read it. But this is the game design document for Star Fox 2. Yeah, so Star Fox 2 didn't come out when it was made. It was made in the 90s, and they released it on the SNES Classic as like a bonus game that you could play on there. So this is like a bit of a cheat, because this document comes from a game that wasn't released. But one of the reasons why I wanted to show it, despite the fact that it's in Japanese and I can't read it, is just because of how graphical it is. You know, we've got stuff you would expect, like here's where the controls sit on the controller and stuff. But just like these flow diagrams of, you sort of see what's going on here, right? This is telling us about what's happening in the gameplay, and this is telling us about the sort of metagame progression of the level select type thing. They're just so clear. It's really important as a designer to get used to doing sketches and thumbnail sketches. And one of the things I always used to get game design students to do were these kind of drawings, where it's not about making a beautiful picture. It's just about kind of a different way to think and express your ideas. Because, you know, when you put an idea down on scribbles like this, you get so much of the game so quickly. Things like the UI, like the heads-up display, and like, is there a thing for collecting coins? Is there a life bar or a number of lives? All of those little things that are just little sketchy things that you get in quite quickly can convey so much about a game that if you wrote them down would take like paragraphs and paragraphs. It's the picture paints 1,000 words thing. Now, you do still need words a lot of the time, but if you can bypass whole chunks of text by just having a couple of really good diagrams, and I mean, look at these, anyone could draw these. They do not require you to be a brilliant artist. They just require you to clearly communicate something. Often, if you can't do that, if you can't take the idea for the game in your head and turn it into that kind of sketch, then it probably is a good indicator that you haven't thought it through well enough yet. So if that's a practice that you haven't got into yet, and you know, if you're working on your own, perhaps you've got less reason to, because you're not trying to show people ideas. But if you are working in a team, whether it's like a student team or some hobby group that you're in, and you're not in the habit of drawing things for each other, have a go. Start using diagrams more, because you might find that you just leapfrog loads of problems that you've had up until now, because you're able to just, well, see things in a different way, which is, you know, actually see them rather than just talk about them or just do them. Again, look, just gorgeous little sketches throughout this document. Anyone who reads Japanese is obviously going to get more out of this one than I do, but I just think there is so much here about how to make a multimedia document which isn't just walls of text. And you can see how sketchy these are again, right? This is Nintendo, this is a big corporation, and these are still sketchy, right? Because one of the things about presenting ideas to other people is sometimes it's better to polish less. Because if you make something look really polished when it's not supposed to be, and it's just supposed to be a rough idea, then people think that you are showing them a final thing that can't be changed, and that, you know, they need to just say yes or no to it. If you show things that are sketched and look rough, then people understand that that is a rough idea of something. So the way that you present things to people can really change how they interpret the document that they're looking at. I cannot stress enough how helpful it can be to go back to, I know this is just a boomer old man yelling at clouds thing, but doing stuff with pencils and getting away from a computer occasionally can just get you so far, and can get you unstuck from habits that you develop from just spending your entire time working directly in an engine. I mean, this is what documentation is supposed to help you do, right? Is to get away from the engine and think about the project from the point of view of a game designer rather than a Unity user or a Godot user or whatever type of technical person. And doing things with like drawing can, you know, take you even a step further away from that, of just to help you think about, like, okay, how many elements are on the screen here? What information is coming to the player through the interface? All of these things you get from drawing in a way that sometimes writing can't help you with. And the other thing to think of here as well is, if you've ever done any teaching or teacher training, they'll teach you about learning styles, and some people like words and some people like pictures, and it's often presented in a very simplistic way. But if you create a document that is multimedia and switches between, there's text, there's diagrams, there's some illustrations that are a bit more to do with the art style than just a sketch. There are tables to show this type of information about the balancing or whatever. If your document switches between media a lot, it's going to hold people's attention more. Part of your responsibility, if you're a designer or a project lead and you're working in a team and you're making documents, part of your responsibility is to make a document that people actually want to look at, which is going to not be walls of text. Because, you know, your document that's in English, that's walls of text, to some people is just going to look like this Japanese one, and they just stare at it and go, I'm an art person, I don't want to read all this. Whereas if you alternate between media throughout, it's going to hold people's attention for longer, and you're more likely then to end up in a situation where your team actually enjoy looking through your documents and contributing to them as well. You know, contributing parts of this, contributing sketches, filling out detail on areas of the project that they own, because no one said a design document has to be written by a single author, and shared authorship is one of the benefits of the modern software we have, and things like Google Docs that we have today, where everyone can open the same document and work on it in tandem. Now, my fifth pick on this list is an indie game, and an indie game that came out in 2013, and this one wasn't necessarily available as a single document. I can't remember how I got hold of this, but it's like a blog, I think, by one of the original developers, and this is from Monaco.
And we are going to need records.
Which, if you haven't played it, is a top-down, like, heist game. And they've written here, this is the original game design document I wrote in 2003. As you can see, it's remarkably similar to the game as it stands today. The game came out in 2013, and the document was written in 2003. Sometimes these things take time. So this is interesting. Andy Schatz Monaco, what is yours is mine. This, like, visualization of the kind of cover art, I guess, is very, very similar to what the game actually looks like these blocks of colour in the black frame. That's like the whole style of the game. You know, talked before about how sometimes you can look at these records and see big chunks that remain in the final thing, and sometimes it's not like that, like with the GTA example, where it's like the whole direction of the project changed. I was working as a programmer for TKO Software, a game dev studio based on Santa Cruz. I was the lead gameplay programmer on a doomed project, a game based on the movie Sahara. While management scrambled to try to get us paying work, the rest of us essentially sat on our hands. Being the ambitious little programmer designer that I was, I brought some designs of mine into the company and suggested that we prototype them. Management gave me free rein to put together the design docs and then prototype the game, while I made sure that I contractually owned the concepts if TKO decided not to develop the games. Very smart. And I think this is interesting project history to see here, and I think it sort of hints at one of the things that I've been wanting to do a video about for a while, is that if you go back through indie games over the last 20 years, a lot of the successful, like the games that really stand out and are on all the top 100 lists, it's very rare for those people to be indie developers who weren't employed as game developers before that. And I think there's a lot of like Kool-Aid around game dev like forums and game dev YouTube now, that being an indie game developer is basically doing a hobby at home and then just lucking out and making it big. It's like a lot of the more successful indie developers, and I don't have stats on this, but I can certainly see it from the history of which games have done well. A lot of the most successful ones were game developers who went indie, right? They were already professional game developers and they went indie. They didn't just start off in a bedroom. They had a job before that, and that's where they learned to do the thing that they're doing. It's like, and that's kind of why I would always encourage people to try and get a job and do the thing as an employee first. Because if you think of any other trade, right, like you're working as a car mechanic or working in a law firm or working as a plumber, any job you can think of that's like a vocation that you need specialist training for, it's very rare for someone to just start their own business without having been someone's apprentice first. This is a really interesting bit of history because it shows you how a kind of really successful indie game, it comes from this like is someone already working in a team and then they go indie later on. One of those designs was Monaco. We only just started making the prototype before word came in that we picked up contract work on EA's remake of GoldenEye, but I've fallen in love with Monaco and it's been a game I wanted to make since then. Monaco is a thief game. Players can go on solo or multiplayer missions to steal jewellery, art and cars from the compounds of the internationally rich and famous. Look and feel, Ocean's 11, Casino Royale and the Italian Job inform the visual style of the game. Monaco combines the low-level game mechanics of Pac-Man married with the stealth features of Hitman. I think that's a good example of the, you know, when you do the elevator pitch and you say it's this mixed with this, you can either have a combination that's too confusing or you can have a combination that's just too redundant, right? It's The Walking Dead meets Day of the Dead, right? That's not a compelling combination of things because they're too similar. And then if you said, oh, it's like The Walking Dead meets, I don't know, Sylvanian Families, that might be so far apart that people can't put it together in their head. So finding a set of things that make people go, that's interesting, but don't confuse them too much and don't sound redundant is quite difficult to do. But here we've got Pac-Man married with Hitman. Monaco is an active stealth game. The player must stay on the move to evade the bad guys. That's what makes it like Pac-Man, right? Players are trying to clean out an environment of all the major, just like eating dots, right? Another way it's like Pac-Man. Like the heroes of the best heist movies, players incapacitate guards rather than kill them. The guards return to action after a short time. Okay, that is interesting because those 3 points are exactly like Pac-Man, which is strange because Pac-Man is such an abstract game. But all three of these things are exactly like Pac-Man and they match up with a heist game. This is a really good example of the fact that your game should be based on tried and tested things that you know work, but which also make sense in a new context. Because if you just copy, then it's like, well, why wouldn't I just play the original thing that you copied this from? But if you can copy and recontextualize like they have done here, then it's like, well, I'm doing a new thing, so that's going to be appealing because of novelty, but I have a reasonably good idea that the new thing will work because I know that those things work in that previous context, right? That's kind of what they're doing here. They're copying Pac-Man and then sort of changing a bunch of stuff, but still retaining the way that those things in Pac-Man work. How is this married to the features of a modern stealth game? The player can find disguises around the environment which, like Pac-Man's power pellets, allow them to move freely until they are discovered. Time-based activities such as picking locks and hacking security radar increase tension and play a counterpoint to the constant movement and action of the heist. I mean, they're arguably also what makes it feel like you're in a real place rather than an abstract maze like in Pac-Man. Multiplayer heists create mind games. Players can save each other after they're captured or rat out their teammates to avoid jail time. That's like a sort of genre convention of this kind of players criminals game. Did Payday have that? I think Payday has that, where you can sort of go Reservoir Dogs and betray each other at the end. I think that's a cool thing to have in a heist game. So this is a menu flow diagram. Splash screen to the title screen to new profile, go to the mansion, go check out character stats, check out black market. This is like a flowchart of all of the menu screens in the game. It's not a fun thing to do, but it is a useful thing to do. And if your game has menus, then you should do this. And you can see some things here that if you've played Monaco aren't in the final game. I don't remember character creation being a thing in the final game because the game ended up being about these different criminal archetypes that have different skills when you collect them. So I'm going to make those GDDs and some other ones that I have available. Don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but you can have them. So check out the link. I'll put them on a Google Drive somewhere. You can download them and look at them yourself. These are all floating around the internet on various places, on Reddit and so on. But it's good to make sure that there's more copies of them because there is nowhere that I know of that is historically archiving these things for people to use, and that's a shame. Whether you just look at these 5 documents or go and look at others, I think one of the big takeaways that you should get from doing this is that there's no one right way to make a document, but I think more importantly it's about the orientation towards what documentation is for. And for me, we saw this in the drawing of diagrams, we saw this in the incorporation of character voice into the document itself. The document is a way of thinking. It's not a static thing that is there to say this is exactly what we'll make. It's part of the process of thinking through what the thing is. And if you've ever written a long academic document like a thesis or something like that, you probably have been through that process there as well, where the writing is kind of the thinking. Okay, you might sit there and just have a little think about what you're doing and then write, but the process of writing the thing out is part of the thinking that helps you come up with your ideas. They're not separate. You don't have thinking here and writing here and then you think and then you write something down and it's perfect. It's not like that. The writing down is something that makes you think, and then as you write you realize that no, you think something else and then you rewrite it. That's what documentation is for. It's like thinking out loud, but using a document rather than a person. You're having a conversation with yourself by writing something down, coming back a week later thinking, oh, is that right? And it's a place to experiment with all of these other things, like starting to think about the influences of the game that you want to include, starting to think about, how the game is based in other things that have been successful. That's a really important thing for design, and I think all of the stuff in the Monaco document where they're comparing it to Pac-Man is a really good example of a designer justifying what they want to do and explaining how they think it's going to be popular and effective because it's based in this other thing that's already been popular and effective but different enough to be new and novel and unique. And that's a really, really important thing for you to do as a designer, is to just be able to justify what you want to do in terms of why it's going to be successful. Because the things you make are never going to be successful just because you put time in, right? You could work on something for months, years, a decade, and the amount of work that you've put into it doesn't increase its value to anyone else. And no one else is going to go, oh wow, this is good because someone spent so much time on it. It's going to be good because of reasons that are internal to them, not reasons that have anything to do with you as a developer, right? That process of talking in your design documentation about why you're doing things and why you think the particular set of things that your game is doing are going to work together. That's really crucial. And I don't think that there is really a thing that I can point at and say, this is how you have to do it. But understanding what this process is meant to achieve, which is to have you think out loud about something in a way that just improves your ideas. I think that's really crucial here, is to understand that documentation, the document isn't a product in itself. I mean, you can think of it that way if it helps you to complete it and it helps you to feel achievement by going, oh yeah, final page of my document is finished. But that's not really the point. The document is a process of thinking. And in a lot of cases, and hopefully, you know, you'll find people you can work with and collaborate, because most indie games that are successful are not made by a single person, and the idea of the, you know, single person Stardew Valley developer that does everything on their own, the Tame Impala of game dev, is incredibly rare, and most of us just do not have a skill set where we're able to do everything to that level of quality. So hopefully you will find people to collaborate with if you haven't done that yet. And that is a place where documentation really comes into its own, because it's a lot easier to have a slow conversation with other people who are living in different time zones and all of this stuff if you have a document to sort of play tennis with and go back and forth and write in the margins and take ownership of different areas of with, and so on. Hopefully you found that interesting and informative. You can download the documents I looked at today in the link below. I'll add some bonus ones in as well.